The scrambling quarterback has often been overlooked at the highest levels, but no one has been able to do it quite like Lamar Jackson as of recent. His speed, athleticism, elusiveness, and arm talent have caused many to compare him to the likes of Michael Vick, but his football story just doesn't end there. Growing up in Pompano Beach, Florida, Lamar would lose his father to a heart attack while already being in tough conditions. In Pop Warner football, he'd play with future teammate Marquise Brown. Later attending Boynton Beach High School, Lamar Jackson would play just 2 seasons of varsity football where he threw for just over 2,200 yards and 31 touchdowns, while also running for an additional 1,600 yards and 22 touchdowns. The skill set of a read option quarterback, while also being just a 3-star, caused many Division I schools to question just how good of a player he really was. He'd still draw interest from big-time places such as Florida, Auburn, and Clemson before finally deciding to commit to Louisville, where head coach Bobby Petrino made a promise to Jackson's mother that Lamar would play quarterback and nothing else. As a freshman, he'd get a lot of playing time, starting in 8 games where he had 1,800 yards passing with 12 touchdowns on top of 960 yards and 11 touchdowns rushing. To start off his sophomore season, Jackson set a school record with 8 touchdowns in the first half to open. Later on versus Florida State, Lamar's 5 touchdowns helped Louisville win 63-20 to give them their highest national ranking since 2006. An all-around historic year, throwing for 3,500 yards, 30 touchdowns, along with 1,500 yards and 21 touchdowns rushing, made Lamar the youngest to ever win Heisman while still being just 19 years old. Being a finalist once again in 2017, Jackson would finish in 3rd place behind Baker Mayfield and Bryce Love. His 5,400 all-purpose yards and 45 touchdowns will win him ACC Athlete of the Year before eventually declaring for the NFL Draft. His elite speed and athleticism was a great mix, which of course caused some people to question whether or not Lamar should play quarterback at the next level. Some people went as far as to say that Jackson should make the switch to a running back or receiver, and his questionable accuracy didn't help that at all. Jackson, of course, was set on being a quarterback. His arm strength and playmaking ability will cause the Baltimore Ravens to trade up to take him 32nd overall in the 2018 draft. Originally being the backup to Joe Flacco, Lamar made his official debut in the second half of a blowout win versus the Buffalo Bills, throwing for just 24 yards and rushing for 39 to open the season. It wasn't until later in the season where he'd make his first start. Replacing an injured Joe Flacco, Jackson threw for 150 yards while also rushing for 117 yards to beat the Cincinnati Bengals 24-21. Overall, he'd start the last 7 games throwing for 1,200 yards and rushing for a little under 700 yards with 11 total touchdowns. With Flacco still out, Lamar became the youngest quarterback to ever start a playoff game at 21 years old versus the Los Angeles Chargers. Despite all his inexperience, Jackson finally found a rhythm for himself towards the end with 2 touchdowns to bring Baltimore back in the game, but being strip-sacked would officially knock the Ravens out and end their season. Right after the season's end, head coach John Harbaugh and the Baltimore Ravens organization decided to fully commit and go all in on creating a new offensive system specifically designed for Lamar Jackson, thus moving on from Joe Flacco. To open the 2019 season, Jackson was on fire, throwing for 324 yards and 5 touchdowns while becoming the youngest quarterback to have a perfect passer rating. Lamar would of course have multiple games with at least 200 passing yards and 100 yards rushing. Playing just like he did at Louisville, Lamar Jackson became the first quarterback since Michael Vick to rush for over 1,000 yards in a season. That, along with 3,100 yards and 36 touchdowns, led the Baltimore Ravens to the best record in the NFL, going 14-2 and eventually becoming the youngest MVP in history, a unanimous MVP at that. With Jackson and the Baltimore Ravens riding high with the best record in the NFL landed them a bye and a matchup with the Tennessee Titans in the divisional round. Despite having over 500 yards of offense by himself, 3 turnovers proved to be costly and the Ravens would end up losing. Jackson came back in 2020 with a solid year. By week 4, he'd reached 5,000 yards passing and 2,000 yards rushing for his career. Leading the Baltimore Ravens to the playoffs once again, Jackson became the first quarterback to have multiple seasons with 1,000 yards rushing. He'd also throw for over 2,700 yards and 26 touchdowns as well. With the Ravens in the wild card, Lamar got his first career playoff win in a rematch versus the Titans while also having over 300 yards total. Facing the Buffalo Bills in a divisional, Jackson was simply shut down and a concussion in the second half sealed the deal and Baltimore would lose 17-3. The Ravens would exercise Jackson's 5th-year option just before the start of the 2021 season. Baltimore was off to another great start, opening in season 5-1. Lamar's 442 yards with 4 touchdowns and an 85% completion percentage on more than 40 passes led coach John Harbaugh to say that it was one of the greatest performances he'd ever seen in a game versus the Colts. With the Ravens at 8-3, Jackson would suffer an ankle injury that completely ruined everything for Baltimore. A team that was already riddled with injuries and now down to their backup quarterback, the Ravens would lose 6 straight games to finish 8-9 and miss the playoffs. Jackson turned down a contract extension because he believed he could get more, Betting on himself in the 2022 season, Lamar led the Ravens to an 8-4 record while being on pace for over 4,200 total yards and 28 touchdowns. He was even leading the league in quarterback rating and passing touchdowns as well. Jackson later faced a disappointing setback when spraining his PCL mid-game, which kept him out for the remainder of the season. The Ravens stayed afloat enough to make the playoffs with a 10-7 record, but their lack of offensive production showed all throughout Jackson's absence as Baltimore went down in a 24-17 loss to the division rival Bengals in the wild card. Following the disappointing end, the Ravens originally placed a franchise tag on Lamar Jackson. He later came out publicly expressing that he requested a trade and was fed up with the organization entirely. A month later, everything would be resolved as Jackson officially signed a 5-year, $260 million contract extension, which at the time made him the highest paid player in NFL history, which also came with a $72.5 million signing bonus. So let's see if Baltimore can finally get over the hump in 2023. Like and comment how you think Lamar and the Baltimore Ravens will do, and subscribe for more storytelling like this.